Number 1.
Kristina was last seen in Hilton Head Island, South Carolina on November 29, 1986. According to her mother, Marilyn Zara, tempers were flaring inside of the family residence, located in the Woodlake Villas condominium complex. The two were arguing about Kristina's curfew, and they shouted at each other as Kristina made a turkey sandwich, and she then proceeded to leave the villa and walk around the condo. Meryl says that she watched Kristina from behind a sliding glass door, and when she noticed her watching, she threw the sandwich at the door and stormed off. A few hours later, Kristina called her mother from a friend's home and returned home at 9:30 p.m. When she came home, she went straight to her bedroom. Meryl went up to her room and said she told her daughter she was happy that she was home and proceeded to tell her that there had to be rules in place and that Kristina couldn't always come and go as she wanted. This made her angry again, and she put on some clothes and walked past her mother down the stairs and out the door at approximately 10:30 p.m. Kristina apparently walked out of the villa and to a phone booth across the street. She called a friend and asked if she could spend the night at their house. The friend's mother said no to this, and Kristina heard this. She said she would sleep by the pool of her apartment complex. Kristina's friend and the friend's brother prepared a sandwich for her and went to the pool, but upon reaching the pool area, she was nowhere to be found. They only found her red sweater lying near the pool. They got scared and began looking for Kristina, but were unable to locate her anywhere in the area. Kristina's mother and father, Joe Porco, became worried for their daughter's safety in the damp and cold outside area, so they went out looking for her, but initially assumed she had called and gone to stay with a friend. The next morning, Kristina's parents panicked when they also found her sweater by the pool. They contacted the police and reported her as missing. Investigators initially considered that Kristina was a runaway, but her mother didn't believe she had run off. There were no indications made by her that she intended to leave on her own, and she didn't appear to have any serious issues with her life at the time. In fact, Kristina had just finished a book report that was due the week after her disappearance, and was auditioning for a solo in a performance with the Showstoppers, a Hilton Head High School musical group. Her costume for her part was found hanging in her bedroom. She was known to hate doing book reports, so it would be unusual for her to do it and then leave. Kristina's mother also stated that if Kristina were to run away, she could have done it earlier during the day when she and her husband weren't at home. She could have packed up and left, but she didn't, and she also had no extra possessions with her at the time. She left her purse, which contained her money and identification cards, on her nightstand, and during the phone call with her friend, she mentioned that she had only 11 cents with her. While authorities did initially list Kristina as a runaway, they have since revised their opinion and believe Kristina was the victim of foul play. Investigators and Meryl believe Kristina was forcibly abducted by a non-family member. When she was on the phone with her friend, she mentioned how a taxi kept passing her, slowly. It's unclear if this is connected to her disappearance in any way. All of Kristina's friends passed polygraph exams about her disappearance. Following the disappearance of her daughter, Meryl actively investigating any and all information that came in about Kristina. She traveled to various places hoping to find her missing daughter. Whenever she got a call, she would drop everything and go. Through her journey, she was bombarded with false leads and tips that only led to disappointment and unfulfilled hope. On September 10, 1990, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, located in Arlington, Virginia, received a telephone call from an individual who claimed Kristina was staying in a safe house in Appleton, Wisconsin, and was going by the alias Mary Joanne Morris. The woman said she believed her companion was in fact the missing girl in the call. A background voice in the call told the caller to tell the operator, "I'm in Appleton in a safe house. That I'm in trouble, and that I need help. I gotta go." It was feared that Kristina was being held against her will in Appleton by a motorcycle gang. Meryl borrowed $1,200 from her employer in Hilton Head, and she traveled by bus for 2 days to Appleton. She recruited 2 newspaper reporters and a helpful police officer who helped to try and locate the woman who was purported to be Kristina, who was missing for 4 years by then. For a week, she visited various halfway houses, runaway shelters, social services agencies, hospitals, and the residences of possible suspects in the case, but none could be located, and there was no evidence of Kristina's whereabouts. Investigators hoped they could receive tapes of the call, but unfortunately, the call was made to the administrative line of the center, and those are not recorded or taped. Meryl was packing to return back home in South Carolina when she received another lead, which caused her to postpone the train ride back home. The tip led her to a group home, where she was able to locate the woman who made the anonymous call. She was also able to find the woman who was supposedly Kristina. Merrill said the woman somewhat resembled her long-lost daughter, and that she appeared to have been using drugs for a long time, and her mental state seemed deteriorated from it. The woman said, "It's me, it's me. I am her, I am her." The woman began to cry and reporters had to drag Merrill out of the premises. Merrill later stated that she was not ungrateful for the lead she received in Wisconsin and was appreciative towards those who tried to help locate her daughter. In fact, she also got a possible lead which stated Kristina resembled a former Cablevision employee. The tip came from 4 employees who worked at Cablevision of the Fox Cities on S. Lawrence Street in Appleton. The name of their former co-worker was Christine, and her last name started with a P. Merrill hoped this lead might end her search for Kristina, but the hopes were dashed after a check of the woman's personal file showed she was 6 years older than Kristina, and her handwriting did not match samples of Kristina's. Even after these 2 leads failed, police in Appleton got various leads and sightings of Kristina. The sightings occurred in grocery stores, automobiles, and taverns. They took place in areas such as Little Chute, Menasha, Chilton, Appleton, and Mountain, Wisconsin. Merrill stated she was extremely grateful for all the support she received in her daughter's case and continued to hold out hope that she would find her daughter someday. On April 10, 1991, a letter purportedly from a satanic cult known as Finders of the Magic Circle was delivered to an Orlando, Florida television station and was an apparent threat. The letter stated that people will get killed everywhere in Florida if their demands were not met. The letter also stated, "We have Christina Joanne Porco from Hilton Head, South Carolina. She is still alive, but not for long. She has sold her soul to Satan and will be the next to sacrifice." The letter was turned over to authorities who took the threats seriously. The next day, they learned of yet another letter from this cult. The letter stated that Kristina would be sacrificed at midnight on April 30, 1991. Investigators in South Carolina were informed about the letter and Merrill was also told about them. She hoped it was a hoax and believed that the individuals behind the letter were possibly playing a cruel hoax on her. She believed they got Kristina's information off of a missing children's website or somewhere else. Several individuals contacted the police and placed Kristina in the Orlando area at the time. When April 30th came, investigators still hadn't found any proof that the letters were credible or not, and Merrill was left in a state of hope and not knowing. She said that without evidence of the sacrifice taking place, she would possibly never know if her daughter was killed or not, as the letter indicated that the sacrifice would take place, with no traces of evidence being left behind from it. The letter stated that the sacrifice of Kristina would be celebrated on Wednesday of that week. According to a spokesman for the Kissimmee Police Department, May 1, 1991 on the cult's calendar is reserved for sacrificing a white female in between the ages of 1 and 25. The demands that this cult stated were the release of 2 men who were being held for the murders of 5 college students in Gainesville, Florida, as well as the release of a man who allegedly robbed skulls from a Florida cemetery. These demands were not met, however. At 4 p.m. on April 30th, the Osceola County Sheriff's Office arrested a 22-year-old man after FBI agents tracked him down and identified him as the writer of these letters. Kristina was not with him, and it was determined that the man falsified the letters and the story about her being held by the cult. He was charged with making written death threats. He had no connections to any satanic cult and worked at a McDonald's. His job application was used in comparison to the letters and the handwriting matched. The man was under suspicion for writing threatening letters to public officials since September of 1990. He admitted to writing the letters and said he got Kristina's information off of newspapers and flyers with their information. He had nothing to do with Kristina's presumed abduction and is not a suspect in the case. There were still sightings of Kristina all over the United States, and there were even leads that she had fled to Canada with an escaped drug dealer from Hilton Head. In November of 2004, investigators began looking at Christopher J. Below as a possible suspect in Kristina's case. Below is a suspected serial killer with several possible victims, all of whom physically resemble Kristina and one another. Below was born in Lorain, Ohio and raised in Kentucky as a child. He was said to be the product of an unhappy marriage which his father, James Below, calls one of the biggest mistakes of his life. While in boot camp, James was served divorce papers from his former wife and Christopher's mother, Doris. This occurred while he was preparing to be shipped off to Vietnam. Christopher was just a year old when this occurred. Doris told Christopher that his father had been killed until years later when James showed up on their doorstep. He wanted to visit and get to know his 5-year-old son he hasn't seen in years. It was a moment that Christopher once described as an experience that scarred him. Doris remarried to a man named Thomas McDaniel whom Christopher didn't get along with whatsoever. As a teenager, Christopher was sent to live with his mother's uncle, William Jellybean Gillespie. Christopher had issues adjusting to the large high school in Henderson, Kentucky, and the farm he lived on in nearby Dawson Springs. The farm was situated in the western reaches of the state where the Ohio River separates Kentucky from Indiana. Family members recall Christopher's love for roaming that rural countryside. Despite the issues he faced, he seemed to have a really good relationship with William and told detectives that he was the only one who ever loved him. By age 12, Christopher began smoking marijuana and would later experience various issues with drugs and alcohol abuse. In 1985, Below graduated from Union County High School and enlisted in the Army. He only stayed for 2 months due to him developing an inflammation beneath his skin. It was an ailment called cellulitis. Below was known to use false stories from the military as ways of swaying women to like him and go out with him. Below's stepfather recalls how he would call home during his army days and report about injuries he sustained while in basic training. This was odd because whenever his stepfather and mother visited him, they found that the only wound he had was a blister on his foot. After the army, Below jumped from job to job. He worked at factories and drove trucks. He at one point tried to rejoin the military, this time the Marines. However, records indicate he failed and didn't even make it to boot camp. He would present himself as a Southern gentleman and would charm many women with fake stories of military heroism and charisma that he knew would attract women. The false pretenses became much more tenuous and his drinking grew into a serious problem. According to one of his former girlfriends, he once lost 2 jobs because he didn't show up for work and was frequently drinking while driving. According to several of the women whom Below charmed, he would promise to pay bills, buy cars, and in general care for them, but he would eventually abandon them, leaving them emotionally and financially drained. He had a habit of running up thousands of dollars in bills for calls to sex lines. He appeared to have a very big sexual appetite that these things went along with. Various people claimed that his appetite did not stop with women. He appeared to have a thing for threesomes with one woman and another man. One woman once recounted how Below brought another man home from a bar so they could have a threesome. In 1991, Below resided in Medina, Ohio, and was having an extramarital affair with a woman, Catherine Fetzer. She was 26 years old at the time and was married to her husband of 5 years at the time. Below was married to his third wife at the time as well. The affair was described as summer-long and extremely secretive. It was so secretive to the point that neither of their spouses suspected anything. They spent time together in the parking lot of Plasticote. They met here as temporary employees. When Catherine left for another assignment, Below would show up at her new workplace on his motorcycle and offer her a ride. The two even worked out a signal for after hours when he wanted her. He would drive past her residence on Lafayette Road in his old white postal Jeep, and the loud muffler sounded the alarm. Fetzer would make a quick excuse to her husband and would then leave with Below to be together in the parking lot of the Super K store in Medina. This continued on for months and months, with Below arousing Catherine with his falsehoods of adventure. On November 26, 1991, Catherine Fetzer disappeared without an absolute trace from her residence in Medina. She left behind a note for her husband, Michael, which stated she was feeling restless and was going to the mall. She never returned home and was never seen or heard from again afterwards. Authorities later discovered her locked vehicle a day later and 20 miles away from where she was last seen. It was found in a gravel truck turnaround on State Route 83 near the Wayne County line. The car was analyzed, but no evidence pointing towards what happened to Catherine was found inside of it. Eventually, however, Michael discovered a box that she stashed away, which had a registered letter from Below which he sent to her. He wrote in it, "I want you to know that I really do miss you, and hoping to see you again real soon." The letter was said to contain many misspellings and tales of heroism and adventure from his fake military career. The original detective who worked on the Catherine Fetzer case was convinced from the start that she was dead and that Christopher had murdered her. But he lacked the actual proof that any crime in relation to her disappearance was committed. 2 weeks after Catherine disappeared, Below went to a pawn shop in Barberton and sold a .380 semi-automatic pistol for $40. It was the same gun he had purchased at a gun show about 17 days before Catherine went missing. In April of 1992, Below's marriage to his third wife was crumbling, and she had something to tell detectives about Below and his link to the disappearance of Catherine. She says that on the same day Fetzer disappeared, Below had a friend help him move a vehicle that looked just like the one Fetzer drove when she disappeared. The detective who investigated Catherine's disappearance went to speak with a friend, Richard A. Lawrence. Lawrence was able to recall everything from that day, and the key to solving the case came closer with every word. According to Lawrence, Below showed up at his Lodi home on November 26, 1991, driving his white postal Jeep, which appeared to be covered in mud at the time. He reportedly asked Lawrence if he would be around later in the day, because he needed help moving a vehicle. He agreed to help, and later during that same day, he followed Below to a set of railroad tracks in southern Medina County near Burbank. There, he observed Below park and leave a blue Ford Tempo. Lawrence stated he was well aware of the fact that Below was having an affair with another woman, but he didn't know it was Fetzer at the time. He then realized it was Fetzer when Below's wife told him that the car belonging to the missing Medina woman was found on the same place that he saw his friend leave the vehicle. Below told Lawrence he had to move the car away from his apartment so his wife would not get suspicious. He claimed he was repairing it to earn money so he could purchase her a gift. Lawrence said that before Below exited Fetzer's vehicle, he appeared to be wiping down the steering wheel and the door as he sat inside the vehicle alone for some time. Below explained he had grease on his hands, which is why he was seen wiping. Lawrence also noticed that the blue tarp Below used to cover his motorcycle was in the back of the Jeep. This was odd because Below never left the motorcycle uncovered. Before anything could happen to Below with this new information about the case, he drove his white Jeep back to his childhood residence in Kentucky. The Jeep and the tarp disappeared after that. Afterwards, Below seemed to show a very dark side with a nasty resentment towards women. In the late 1990s, he got a tattoo on his chest which depicted two women, one with pretty, long hair and the other with horns. He would later state in a police interrogation, "This is the way women are. When you meet her, she's all nice and sweet. Later she turns into a blood-sucking whore." Below's half-sister, Melinda Bass, would later recount how her brother usually zeroed in on women who were considered not the best looking. She explained that he could not deal with rejection and remembers him saying, "I can't handle being turned away." It would take years for Below to admit to his involvement in the presumed death of Catherine Fetzer. In November of 2003, Below resided in Evansville when he was taken downtown by authorities so they could question him regarding an accusation that he molested his niece. When they were done questioning him, the detective currently assigned to the Fetzer investigation walked into the interrogation room. Below did not know that he was a detective from Medina, but the detective advised him of this. The detective stated he was there to charge Below with the aggravated murder of Catherine Fetzer and that the game was over. Below nearly fell out of his chair after hearing this. After 4 hours of interrogation, Below finally admitted that he killed Fetzer by shooting her in his apartment in Medina. He kept saying he was screwed in the head. Below was asked about where he put her body and stated he left her in a dumpster. Detectives believe he is likely lying about this story. Due to the nature of the crime, Below could have been sentenced to life in prison for Fetzer's death, but he avoided trial, and that by agreeing to plead guilty to a charge of attempted involuntary manslaughter. He was convicted in September of 2004 and was sentenced to serve between 11 and 18 years in prison. He's currently at the Marion Correctional Institution. Investigators also suspect he was possibly involved in the abduction of Heather Daney L. Teague from Spotsville, Kentucky. Teague was grabbed by an unidentified gunman while she sunbathed on Newburgh Beach, and he dragged her into the woods by the hair at gunpoint. She hasn't been seen since then. A composite sketch made of the abductor appeared to match another suspect in the case who later committed suicide, but the eyewitness to Teague's kidnapping now says it's possible Below was the one who took Heather. Below was in Kentucky at the time of Teague's disappearance, and he left the area on the same day that the original suspect committed suicide. He has denied any involvement in Heather's case, but investigators consider him to be a person of interest in the case, and it's possible he and the other suspect in the case worked together in order to take and kill her. Heather shared friends and acquaintances with Below at the time of her abduction. Investigators also believe he might have been responsible for the disappearance of Shailene Marie Farrell, who went missing from Piqua, Ohio on August 8, 1994. She was last seen leaving her family's residence to run a quick errand, but she never returned home and hasn't been seen since. Foul play is suspected in her disappearance. Christopher has also been mentioned in the case of Mary Teresa Cousteau. She disappeared from St. Cloud, Florida on May 5, 1998. She was last seen leaving a local bar following an argument she had with her estranged husband at approximately 1:30 a.m. She has never been seen or heard from since. Investigators have noted that Christopher Below was in the St. Cloud area at the time of Mary's disappearance. Investigators began to look at Below in Kristina's case because investigators found a missing persons flyer of her in his residence in Lodi, Ohio during 1992. In fact, Melissa told investigators when her brother came to stay with her in her Evansville in 2000, Christopher had a shoebox of treasures that he always kept with him. He once told her that if anything were to happen to him, she would keep the box with her. Melissa went through the box and stated that inside were an assortment of letters, nude photographs of his ex-wife in Georgia, some jewelry and a ring he said he got from his uncle. But, perhaps the most disturbing thing inside this box were the 5 or 6 flyers of missing women. They all had long, dark-colored hair and were petite in size. When Below found out about Melissa's snooping, he put the box in a larger box with a lock and put it somewhere. Investigators hope to locate it at some point. Investigators have also noted how in some pictures of Below over the years, he appeared to be wearing women's jewelry since they were small on him. They suspect he may have kept souvenirs from his victims. In November of 2004, a detective from South Carolina went to the Ohio Correctional Facility where Below was serving his sentence for the murder of Catherine Fetzer so that he could question him about the Porco case. The detective stated he had received more background information on Below and hopes to either eliminate him as a suspect or pursue him in the case. Below was known to be living in South Carolina during the late 1980s, and they are trying to pinpoint his whereabouts at the time of Kristina's disappearance. It should be noted that Below has not been criminally charged with any of the cases, besides the case of Catherine Fetzer, and only speculation and theories link him to the other cases. At the time of her disappearance, Kristina was described as an average student at Hilton Head High School. She was originally from Johnsburg, New York. Her mother remembers her singing with the Hilton Head High School choir and how she would teach Christmas carols in French to second graders. She also loved to swim in Lake George. Kristina had owned a golden retriever at the time of her disappearance, and the dog would sleep next to her bed in her bedroom for 6 years after her disappearance. It passed away while sleeping in there. It should be noted that Kristina's savings account, which contained between $100 and $200, hasn't been utilized for any purpose since 1986. Merrill continued to search for her daughter for many years. She theorizes that Kristina's remains are possibly in the North Forest Beach area. She held out hope for years that her daughter would be found alive and received help from many people during her fight for answers. John Walsh was one of many people to help Merrill. He is very well known for the television series America's Most Wanted. His own son, Adam Walsh, was abducted and murdered in 1981. Frustrated by the lack of action and help when he was still missing, John and his wife, Reeve, helped to establish the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 1984. During the center's early years, John offered his assistance to Merrill. He offered a cash reward for any information leading to the whereabouts of Kristina. Her disappearance was also featured in a 6-minute segment on A Current Affair in April of 1991. In 1989, Merrill started the Parents of Runaways or Missing Children in the Southeast program. Through her work, the organization helped the FBI and police in photographing, fingerprinting, and making voice audio recordings of children. She once made the records of over 5,100 children in one day. She and Kristina's father, Joe, divorced in 1988, and she moved back to Johnsburg in the years following her daughter's disappearance. She passed away in 2009. In her obituary, she listed Kristina as surviving her. Kristina has never been found, and her disappearance remains unsolved. A memorial service for her was held in Hilton Head in April of 1993. She once had a brother, but he was killed in a vehicle accident when she was a month old. Foul play is suspected in her case. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact Beaufort County Sheriff's Office 843-689-4300.
Number 2.
Audrey Nierenberg was last seen in Staten Island, New York on July 15, 1977. She was last seen leaving her family's residence in the 1200 block of Ryder Street in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn, New York, at approximately 2 p.m. Nierenberg told her mother that she was simply walking to the store 2 blocks away to purchase cigarettes. She was never seen again. Audrey was previously hospitalized for brief periods of time between 1974 and 1977 as a result of her schizophrenia. She's been placed in multiple medical facilities such as the Kongs County Hospital in Brooklyn, Gracie Square Hospital in Manhattan, and the Hillside Medical Center in Queens. She was an outpatient at Kingsborough Psychiatric Center at the time of her disappearance. Investigators have considered the possibility that Audrey left her home while disoriented and did not know her name. She was not carrying any identification or medication with her when she left. They believed it was possible that Audrey was admitted to a medical facility or hospital under the name Jane Doe, which is a name given to a patient whose identity cannot be confirmed. Investigators and police did a search of medical facilities, but found no record to indicate Audrey had been admitted to any of them. Her parents do not believe this occurred and stated that Audrey was doing very well with her medication before she disappeared and was able to make it her destination safely. Audrey had no friends or acquaintances at the time and did not attend school. She used to attend an adult daycare center until it closed. Audrey had no history of leaving on her own, and while she did sometimes get lost while out on her own, she knew to call her family if she needed help. Later during the day she disappeared, Audrey's father received a ransom demand. The caller on the other end stated that he had better collect all the money he possibly could before he ever called back in exchange for her safe return. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was called and officials arrived at the home. They left later on when the person failed to call after 3 hours. Audrey's parents speculate that the caller was from the Flatbush area and watched as the officials entered their home that day. They believe it might have been someone who was known to the Nierenberg family. Investigators have been unable to confirm the identity of the person who called and made no attempts of tracing the call's location. On July 14, 1977, Audrey went with her family to Staten Island, New York, and they watched a movie at the Jerry Lewis Theater on Forest Avenue in Mariners Harbor. There is speculation that Audrey might have traveled back to Staten Island, since her mental illness sometimes caused her to repeat previous actions. A mentally incompetent predator known as Audrey Rand has been looked at in relation to Nierenberg's disappearance. In 1987, Rand abducted and murdered 12-year-old Jennifer Schweiger of Staten Island. Her body was found near Rand's former campsite. The campsite was also located near the theater that Audrey and her family visited the day before her disappearance. Rand was not convicted of killing Jennifer but was convicted of her abduction. Rand is considered a possible suspect in the 1972 disappearance of Alice Pereira, the 1978 disappearance of Ethel Atwell, the 1983 abduction of Tyus Jackson, and the 1984 disappearance of Henry Gaforio. In 2004, Rand was convicted of kidnapping Holly Hughes, who disappeared in 1981. She remains missing. Investigators believe that Rand might have been involved in several other missing persons cases in the Staten Island area, but there's no evidence that implicated him in any of them. Investigators have found no evidence he was involved in Audrey's case, but there's much speculation that points towards the possibility. Investigators also looked at a friend of Audrey's brother as a possible suspect in her disappearance. In 1982, he was convicted of stabbing a woman and sentenced to 18 years in prison. The woman did survive the attack, however. Her father did not like the boy and would never allow him inside of the home. He lived 1 block away from her home. He was questioned and interviewed after his conviction about Audrey's disappearance, but investigators had no evidence to show he was involved, and he refused to take a polygraph test in her case. After Audrey vanished, he never asked to go inside the home. He has since been released from prison and now lives in New York City. Before Audrey vanished, she accused the operator of a Flatbush area ice cream parlor of raping her. He denied the allegation, however, and stated that it was consensual sex. No charges were filed against him, and it's unknown if he's considered a suspect in the case. A large hole once stood on the walls but was cemented over after her disappearance. It's unknown if the hole had any connection to her case. The owner sold the business and moved away from the area approximately 3 months after Audrey's disappearance. Investigators believe that foul play was involved in the case and that Nierenberg might be deceased. Her father believes that Audrey was adopted into a new family who gave her a new name and social security number. Audrey's social security number hasn't been used since 1977. At the time of her disappearance, Audrey enjoyed shopping, music, and dancing. Her parents have since moved to Citrus Springs, Florida. They continue to search for their missing daughter. Investigators have never closed her case, and it remains an active investigation. Audrey's disappearance remains unsolved. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact New York City Police Department 646-610-6914.
Number 3.
Jeffrey was last seen in Pomona, California on August 19, 1994. He was last seen by friends playing drums at a music studio. He was never seen again afterwards. Approximately 6 weeks after his disappearance, his white 1990 Ford Ranger was found abandoned on a dirt road located 35 miles south of Colorado City, Arizona. His car was hundreds of miles away from his home in West Covina, California. The car was locked, and the alarm and kill switch had been set. There was no sign of Jeffrey at the scene of his car. In 1998, Jeffrey's father received a tip that he was seen in St. George, Utah, but this lead did not come of anything, and Jeffrey remains missing. Jeffrey has gone on skiing trips to Utah, but he did not know anyone that lived there. At the time of his disappearance, Jeffrey was described as a normal teenager who was not a troublemaker. He worked for his father since high school and was described as a good student. He had actually registered for classes at Fullerton College a few weeks before his disappearance. Investigators do not believe he left on his own accord because he hasn't used his bank account since he went missing. Jeffrey's disappearance remains unsolved and his whereabouts a mystery. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact West Covina Police Department 626-814-8501.
Number 4.
Toni was last seen in Clairton, Pennsylvania on November 5, 1981. She reportedly left her family's residence located in the 900 block of Van Kirk Street and walked to the corner store with a friend, where she purchased a bag of chips and a soda. Afterwards, Toni went to her friend's house and chatted until about 5 p.m., and then she left 20 minutes later to begin walking to Clairton High School, which was 6 blocks away. She was going to attend a pep rally there, and she was supposed to meet her boyfriend, Bobby Varva, at approximately 6 p.m., so they could go together. That day, the temperatures were described as being ideal and quite nice, but by the evening, it got cooler, and it began to heavily rain. On her way to the pep rally, Toni stopped at a friend, Beth's, residence. They spoke to each other for a few minutes before Toni said she had to go. She told Beth that she was meeting Bobby and that she had something very important to tell him that evening, but she didn't elaborate on what that was. She began walking again at 5:30 p.m. Beth told authorities that she saw Toni walk off into the rain. Bobby stated that he waited at the end of Rose Avenue where he was supposed to meet her at approximately 6 p.m. He waited until 6:15 p.m., but Toni never showed up to the designated meeting place. Bobby went to the pep rally to see if maybe Toni was there or if any of her friends knew where she was. He spoke to some of her friends there, but none of them had seen her, and she never actually made it to the rally that evening. Bobby later said he was confused as to why she missed their date, but that he wasn't overly concerned with her absence. Toni was allegedly last seen by another classmate walking in the 600 block of Miller Avenue, which was 4 blocks away from her home. She was walking in the direction of the high school at the time. The classmate said he stopped and said hello to Toni, who said the same back to him. This area was just across the street from the bar where Toni's mother, Audrey Chiopeta, worked as a bartender. Investigators do not know what time she actually disappeared at. Some agencies claim she was last seen at 7 p.m. or 7:15 p.m. during that evening, while it's clear she vanished at some point between 5:30 p.m. and 6 p.m. Toni was also supposed to babysit a neighbor's child that evening, but she never showed up to the house. According to her father, Henry Samuel Sam Chiopeta, he arrived home from work at approximately 6 p.m., and Toni was not there. Audrey finished her shift at 7:30 p.m. and arrived home as well. As the time went on, Sam grew concerned about Toni's whereabouts, and so did Audrey. Sam initially assumed that Toni had gone to a neighborhood home to babysit after the pep rally, and forgot to mention it. After Audrey got home from her shift, Toni still wasn't home, and they both went into panic mode. Audrey drove up and down the street looking for Toni. Meanwhile, Sam began knocking on the doors of neighbors, looking for any sign of the child. It was clear by midnight that something had happened to Toni and that she wasn't coming back home. As a result, her parents contacted the authorities and filed a missing persons report. Early the next morning, police spread out across town in search of Toni. They also searched wooded areas and streams in the area that she went missing from. Investigators questioned various neighborhood residents to see if any of them had seen Toni during the previous evening. No one had really seen her, but according to her friends who had seen her, she was walking in the vicinity of her house in the direction of the high school. Investigators initially suspected that Toni had run away on her own accord. However, her parents stated she would never have done this. Toni's friends also said they didn't think she had run away, and she never mentioned any plans of wanting to do so. Although her friends and family hoped she was alive and maybe she did run off, she would have contacted her mother eventually since they were very close, and she wouldn't allow her to worry like this. Investigators now doubt she left on her own accord as she was said to be responsible, honest, dependable, and didn't appear to have any major problems at the time of her disappearance. Following her disappearance, Sam began to search intensively for his missing daughter. He worked as a trucker for the United Transfer Company at the time of his daughter's disappearance. He was constantly on the search for his daughter and would do everything he could to find her. Due to his job, his boss contacted the head of the United Van Lines, the parent company of the transfer company, and had them send out posters with Toni's description and photo to all 3,000 of the company's drivers. The United Van Lines truckers established a nationwide communications network, but this did little to nothing for this search. Sam continued to seek out leads regarding her whereabouts. He even tried collecting clues along his Monyo truck route and had his boss's permission to quit work for the day if he got any leads about Toni. He once received a tip that a girl matching her description was spotted in Uniontown. He was doing a delivery there, so he spent the entire night asking people in the area if they had seen his daughter. The tip ended up as a dead end. Sam would spend up to 20 hours a day working and then would switch to his investigation in Toni's case. He would even carry her photograph with him and interrogate everyone he came across. Sam spoke to the media openly about his daughter's disappearance and his own search for answers. However, he would ask reporters to not take his photo and publish it in the news so that he could effectively continue his search for Toni. They respected his wishes. Investigators believe it's possible Toni was abducted by a non-family member on the night of her disappearance. Soon after she went missing, there were reports that she had been forced into a van while she was walking near her home. However, investigators stated they did not believe this to be true. The area that Toni lived in was described as being heavily populated, with rows of neat, well-kept houses. Authorities described the neighborhood as a good place where parents would want to raise children. They feel that if someone forcibly abducted Toni, she would have screamed or created a scene, and someone would have heard her. No one heard or saw anything suspicious on the evening that she disappeared, and there were no signs of an abduction occurring. There was initial suspicion that Toni's disappearance could have been connected to another girl who went missing just before she did. On October 26, 1981, 15-year-old Christine Gunther left school early that day to head to a doctor's appointment. It was a routine checkup for an ear infection she had a few months earlier. She was last seen at 1 p.m., waiting for the bus at Donaldson's Crossroads on Route 19 in Peters Township. Several witnesses saw her waiting, and one of her friends waved to her as she passed her. According to reports, Christine never got on the bus and never made it to the appointment. Christine was reported missing when she never came back home. 5 days after her disappearance, her body was discovered by a hunter in a wooded area of South Fayette Township, approximately 20 feet off Cecil Sturgeon Road. She was fully clothed and was wearing the same clothing she had on when she vanished. Her early dismissal slip along with $3 in cash was found in her slacks. There was no evidence of sexual assault. An autopsy determined that Christine was killed by multiple penetrating wounds of the head and brain. Her wounds were consistent with a small axe or a hatchet. The coroner estimated that she was killed less than 48 hours before her body was found. This means that she was alive for at least 4 days after her disappearance, which occurred on a Monday. Her body was discovered on a Friday. There was also no evidence that she had been bound or gagged prior to her death. While the two disappearances occurred relatively close to each other in time, there was no evidence to indicate a connection between the two. Christine's killers has never been caught, and her murder remains unsolved. Investigators began to believe that something bad had happened to Toni, and that she was no longer believed to be a runaway child. Approximately 4 months after Toni's disappearance in 1982, as the woods were beginning to thaw, a man contacted the Clairton police station with alleged information on her whereabouts. The man said, "Your little missing girl is at the bottom of Peters Creek," before he hung up the phone. Investigators searched the area he indicated for any trace of Toni, but turned up nothing. It's unclear if the lead was credible since nothing has been found. Investigators have stated that a primary suspect in Toni's disappearance was her own father, Sam. The original detective assigned to her case later stated that he always felt suspicious of him ever since the night Toni was reported as missing. Sam always maintained that he came back home to an empty house, but he always seemed a bit edgy whenever speaking about that night. This led investigators to believe he was hiding something and that he knew more about his daughter's disappearance than he let on. It's not even definitively known if Sam is Toni's biological father or her sister's. He might have been her stepfather. Toni did not use his last name when she went missing, and her relationship with him was described as chaotic. Toni was said to be somewhat afraid of him prior to her disappearance in 1981. Police responded to several domestic violence cases at the home, and on one of these occasions, the police were called to the home after Sam fired a gun in the house early one morning. No one was injured during this event. According to reports, Toni seemed eager to get out of her house quite often. During August or early September of 1981, Toni left her home and went to live with her grandparents in Uniontown for some time until the new school year began, at which time she went back home. Investigators have stated it's possible Sam was sexually abusing one or more of the girls, including Toni herself. Sam took a polygraph regarding her disappearance soon after it occurred, and when asked if he had anything to do with her disappearance, he showed signs of deception. In 1982, a sobbing Audrey Chiopeta would go to the detective and state that she believed Sam did indeed have something to do with Toni's case, and that he may have harmed her on the night of her disappearance. When the case began, Audrey stood by her husband and would maintain that no one in the family had any involvement in her disappearance, and that Sam was not guilty of doing anything to his daughter. However, when she went to the detective, she stated she had withheld information when she reported Toni as missing in 1981. Audrey initially claimed that she came home to find nothing weird or amiss about the residence at all, but she later stated this was not true. She stated that when she arrived home, she discovered that the blouse Toni had worn to school that day was hanging in the laundry room in the basement. She noted that it was damp at the time. Audrey said she tried to convince herself at the time that Toni must have done the laundry when she came home from school that day. Toni was known to do her own laundry, and she knew that anything too delicate to be put in the dryer was to be hung on the clothesline that went across the laundry room. However, there were no indications that she actually did laundry that day, because her blouse was the only thing hanging on the line. There likely would have been more articles of clothing present to indicate she had indeed done the laundry. There were no piles of clothing that were ready to be put away. Audrey said she withheld the information because she feared what Sam would do if she revealed it. Investigators believe that the blouse is evidence that Toni had indeed returned home during the evening of her disappearance. It began raining heavily when she was walking to the pep rally. They believe Toni might have been unprepared for the rainy weather, so she returned to her residence after 6 p.m. so she could get a change of clothing and crossed paths with Sam since he came home at that time. While this is a possibility, Audrey stated that there were no signs of a physical struggle in the residence to indicate Sam harmed Toni, however. Investigators nonetheless believe Toni was possibly killed inside a residence during the evening by Sam. They believe it was likely an accident and that he disposed of her body in the area. Not long after Toni's disappearance, Sam replaced the wooden deck in his backyard with a cement one. This was seen as odd because he was not known for performing household improvements. There were rumors that Toni's body was encased in the cement or that she was buried underneath it. Whether Sam was involved in his daughter's disappearance or not might never be determined. There was never enough evidence to prove he indeed had a hand in her demise. However, it is strongly believed that Toni was the victim of a homicide, and her family no longer has hope she'll turn up alive. Sam passed away in 2003. There were possible witnesses who saw Toni walking several blocks past the high school that night, which would technically make it improbable for Sam to be involved, but then again these accounts have not been confirmed. Authorities said this confused them because Toni had no reason to be in that part of town at that hour, unless she wasn't planning on attending the pep rally that evening like most accounts state. It's possible she might have had other plans besides the pep rally. In August of 2001, authorities announced they were taking a fresh look at Toni's decades-old case. A man named Dean Maskin, a municipal worker, was charged with raping a woman in her own home in Clairton. He turned himself into authorities after the woman identified him as her assailant that attacked her on August 16 of that year. The woman stated the attack occurred after she asked for help with sewer problems she had been having at the time. She told city employees about the issue, and she later saw them working near her home. She said that a worker with the name Dean on his municipal employee name tag had offered to take a look at her sewer problem, and he came to her residence the next day. She showed him into her basement where she left him to take a look at the problem. After he returned a short time later, Maskin demanded sex from the woman as payment for what he did. He exposed his body to her and then forced himself on her. Maskin was charged with rape, aggravated indecent sexual assault, unlawful restraint, and indecent assault. He was placed on bond and ordered to undergo an evaluation at a behavioral clinic. Investigators stated that he was considered a possible suspect in Toni's disappearance following the incident because he was friends with her family in 1981 and was a neighbor to Toni as well. Her family stated that Toni would have known him well enough to trust him in 1981. Maskin was originally questioned in relation to Toni's disappearance in 1981 and wasn't considered a suspect in the case until 2001. It's possible that Dean crossed paths with Toni while she was walking to the pep rally that evening. However, there is no evidence linking him to her disappearance, and he has denied any wrongdoing in her case. Investigators still consider him as a possible suspect in the case, however. Toni's sisters, Roxanne and Lee, are both still alive and continue to hope that they'll find out what happened to their youngest sister in 1981. They believe she was probably abducted by someone she knew at the time of her disappearance. Roxanne believes Toni was taken from their home by someone she knew following a possible assault. Meanwhile, Lee believes someone abducted her sister while she was walking outside in the rain. The two have suspicions about a man who was associated with Sam at the time of Toni's disappearance. While this man hasn't officially been labeled as a suspect in the case, the half-sisters theorize that he might have seen Toni walking in the rain and offered her a ride. She likely would have accepted the ride since she trusted this individual at the time. There isn't any evidence of this, but the sisters believe nonetheless that Toni's disappearance was caused by someone she knew and trusted. In September of 1985, the city of Clairton went bankrupt and as a result, they laid off their entire police force. This meant that all law enforcement-related matters were to be handled by the Pennsylvania State Police, and this meant that detectives had to turn over all investigative files, including their files on Toni's missing persons case. While the original detectives on the case felt the state police were capable of properly investigating the case, but since the state police had higher caseloads, they wouldn't be able to dedicate as much time to the case. The Clairton police force was reinstated in 1992, but Toni's missing persons case was kept in the possession of state police, and they remained in charge of the investigation. Toni's family was not pleased with this decision, and her sisters feel the state police don't care about the investigation and whether it gets solved or not. The current detective on the case has stated that Toni's disappearance remains an active police investigation. At the time of her disappearance, Toni was described as a hard worker who babysat for several neighborhood families in 1981. She also worked bingo nights at St. Joseph Church for 2 nights during the week. She was described by loved ones and friends as a happy, loving girl who was fun to be around. She wasn't the type of teenager to cause trouble, and she didn't seem all that interested in parties, makeup, steady relationships, and she was known to obey every rule her parents set in place for her. Toni was a 9th grade student at Clairton High School in 1981 and was described as an average student. Most who knew her said she seemed like a tomboy at the time of her disappearance, and she was said to be talkative, responsible, and she was known to enjoy things such as baton twirling and swimming. She even wanted to become a honey bear majorette for the high school marching band. Audrey passed away in 2006. Toni's disappearance remains unsolved and foul play is suspected. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact Pennsylvania State Police 412-929-6262.
Number 5.
Rickey was last seen in Monroe City, Missouri on June 30, 1977. He was last seen leaving his father's residence with an unidentified individual. The person owned a vehicle with Illinois state license plates. He told his family he would be back soon but never came back. He has never been heard from again. Investigators have checked to see if Enoch's DNA matched any unidentified victims of serial killer John Wayne Gacy. He has been ruled out for most of them. It's been considered either way that Gacy might have killed Enochs. He was known to travel through Missouri. His possible connection to the case was given by a psychic. It's also been suggested that Gacy could be responsible for the 1967 disappearances of Joel Hoag, William Hoag, and Edwin Dowell from Hannibal, Mo, and the 1968 disappearance of John Wagner from Monroe City. There's no evidence that Gacy was involved in Enoch's case, but he did commit many of his crimes in Illinois, and the person that Enochs left with had Illinois license plates. Very little information is available about his disappearance, but investigators do not believe he disappeared voluntarily, as he left all of his personal belongings behind. Foul play is suspected in his case. His case remains unsolved. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact Monroe City Police Department 573-735-4431.
Number 6.
Angelica Gandara was last seen in Temple, Texas on July 14, 1985. She was seen 2 blocks away from her grandmother's home as she walked back to her family's residence. She was last seen at approximately 5 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. She was seen inside of a 1977 Chevrolet pickup truck with a Caucasian male and female. She was seen in this truck approximately 2 blocks away from her grandmother's house. The truck was described as dirty, dented, and generally broken. Its hood, front fender, and bed were painted red and white, and the doors were colored blue and white. The top of the truck was painted white as well. Angelica has never been seen or heard from again. Investigators believe that Angelica was abducted and possibly murdered. About 1 day before she's disappeared, a neighbor stated they had seen her pushing a baby stroller with her niece inside of it. The neighbor stated that someone driving a blue car pulled up beside the girl and attempted to offer her a ride, but Angelica continued walking. The car circled around the block and slowed down alongside her one more time before driving off. Investigators are not sure if the car had any link to Angelica's abduction, but the incident was strange in nature, and she never mentioned it to her family before she disappeared the next day. There were possible sightings of Angelica after her abduction. A clerk at a Shamrock convenience store located in San Antonio, Texas reported that he had seen Angelica in late July of 1985, after she disappeared. San Antonio is approximately 150 miles away from Temple, Texas. During the sightings, the clerk would observe a girl who matched Angelica's description her out of a vehicle driven by a man to go in the store and make purchases. The girl would always appear to be nervous and would make quick purchases, as if she was in a hurry. She was always quiet and never said anything when she went inside. The driver of the car would wait across the street until she came back out to leave. The clerk thought nothing of the girl or her companion until they found out about Angelica's disappearance. The next time she came, he tried to delay the girl by offering her a drink, and when he went to call the police, the man who drove her came inside and grabbed the girl. He told the clerk not to say anything and left. The clerk was not able to describe what the man looked like, and the girl has not been positively identified as Angelica. Investigators have also been unable to substantiate the claims either. 2 suspects have been named in her disappearance. One of them is a man named Ramiro Ruby Ibarra. In 1987, he raped and murdered a girl inside her home in Waco, Texas. He was an acquaintance of the girl's family and broke into the home before killing her. He was convicted of the crime in 1997 and was sentenced to death. He is currently on death row. Investigators have no evidence that he abducted Angelica, but he remains a possible suspect in the case. In 2007, authorities announced that a man named David Elliott Penton was a possible suspect in Angelica's case. He is suspected in the murders of several other young girls. He's also a suspect in the 1983 abduction of Amber Crum and the 1986 abduction of Ara Johnson. Penton was actually also responsible for the 1984 death of his own infant son, and in 1987, he murdered a friend's 9-year-old niece in Ohio. He has been incarcerated in Ohio since 1987. Some of Penton's cellmates stated that Penton claimed responsibility for the disappearances of Angelica, Amber, and Ara. This has not been proven. At the time of her disappearance, Angelica lived in the 800 block of North 6th Street. Her disappearance remains unsolved. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact Temple Police Department 254-770-5506.